49.
The Radio Whammo Breakfast.
Talking politics with Phil Goff.
Leader of the Labour Party is joining me on the line in the car this morning. Good morning, Phil.
Yeah, g'day, Whammo.
Pretty exciting week being budget week. No doubt there'll be plenty to attack the government on real issues, right?
Well, I think we're going to see some bad things in the budget. And one of the worst things, of course, is that the deficit will be about $16 billion, considering that for 9 years Labor ran a budget that was in surplus. To have a $16 billion deficit this year is appalling and unsustainable.
We're on hard times, though. The world is on hard times, Phil.
Well, yeah, that's true. But at the height of the hard times, which was at the global financial crisis in 2008, John Key made this promise. He says, we're going to cut your taxes by billions and billions and billions of dollars. And while we do that, we're not going to put GST up. We're not going to touch KiwiSaver. We're not going to touch student loans. We're not going to touch working for families. He made those promises recklessly, and now he's reaping the whirlwind out of that. He made promises that he couldn't sustain, and what's more, 2.5 years into the National Government's term in office, since the last budget, there's been no economic growth, and that was before the earthquakes that was happening. So no growth, no extra revenue, falling revenue, and promises he couldn't sustain.
Yeah.
Now he's dealing with the consequence of his own actions.
Now, can you clarify something for us as well? Because I've heard that the government is borrowing more than they need this year. Is that right?
Yeah, they are, because it's quite favourable terms to borrow on. So the $300 million a week that he was borrowing before the earthquakes has now gone up to $380 million a week. So, yeah, getting the money on reasonable terms, but you still can't keep borrowing $380 million a week indefinitely.
But does it mean that they borrow less next year?
It probably does mean that they'll borrow less when the cost of that borrowing goes up. So they're pre-borrowing some of it, but you could rely on the figure of $300 million a week as what they've been borrowing over the last couple of years. So because they're earning less than they're spending.
So I guess most people realise that, well, the books aren't looking very good. We've just sort of been coasting along, and there's been sort of no real, ways of tackling this massive debt. So I guess people are looking for a viable alternative, and I think a lot of people still haven't found that in Labour. They can't see exactly what you guys would do differently.
Well, let me give you just a couple of things for starters. What you have to do is get the economy moving. There's a range of things that are just common sense things that you do so that you can get the economy growing, you can get incomes up, you can get job growth. One of them is upskilling New Zealanders, and what's been happening is that money's been pulled out of skilled training instead of going into it, to the extent that we've got half the skilled tradespeople that we'll need in building and construction for next year, half. Okay, so upskilling's the first alternative Labor's talking about. Secondly, you'll only be a wealthy country if you're a smart economy. And they halved the amount of money that would otherwise have been going into research and development. If we're not prepared to invest in growth, you won't get growth, you won't get increased revenue return. Thirdly, monetary policy. It tends, monetary and taxation, it tends to favour investment and speculation rather than investment in the productive and export industry. Speculation doesn't make your country wealthier. So, there's three areas where Labor will be absolutely different from what this government is doing. Okay.
What about in other areas where the government has been making and tinkering around the edges at the moment, making changes, where Labor will go into the debating chamber and say, we don't agree with this, but we're going to vote with you anyway. That seems to be sort of an ongoing story over the past year or two. At what point does Labor, for some of this legislation that's going through, just put a line in the sand and go, no, look, we don't support it, so therefore we're not voting for it?
Well, we do that on the worst instances of the government legislation, but curiously, when you're in opposition, Whammo, you get accused of the opposite. You're opposing everything. Actually, we don't. Sometimes we give the government the benefit of the doubt, as we have over Christchurch. We know they needed the proper powers to get that city going again. We were worried about how they were going to do it, but we gave them the benefit of the doubt, but said at the same time we'd be holding them to account for what they're doing, and we're doing exactly that.
The government looks like they're going to be looking for these changes to KiwiSaver, but Labor isn't saying that they would roll back the changes.
Well, we're against the changes, and there's a whole lot of reasons why we're against the changes. KiwiSaver, which was Labour's initiative, has got 1.7 million New Zealanders in it. It's raising a lot of money that would not otherwise be saved, and we need to save more as a country. Now, people went into KiwiSaver in good faith. It was a contract, but one party, the government, has broken that contract. And you know, you just have a look back at what National said. They promised they wouldn't touch it. They promised they would not make the changes that they're now making, and we think it's wrong that they're still intending to do that. And what I've said is this, Whammo. Yeah, look, you've got to find savings, but before you start tinkering with KiwiSaver, which is working, what about hauling back some of the massive tax cuts that you gave to the top few percent of the country? $2.5 billion a year spent on tax cuts to the top 10%. If you have to find some savings, why take it out on low and middle income Kiwi savers before you've actually required people that got the big windfall gains at the top to give just some of that back to play their part in sharing the sacrifice of what needs to be done.
Phil Goff, thanks very much for your time this morning. Cheers.
Okay, thanks very much. Catch you next week. Cheers, mate.
Leader of the Labour Party, Phil Goff, there this morning, and it's now 4 minutes away.